Right, we're going to sum up the theory of strength and conditioning in, is it 25 minutes? 25 minutes. So this is going to be really, really fast. And won't answer anything really. But anyway, we'll try and give you an idea of what we're trying to do. Some of it's quite nice and easy. And it's quite applicable to anybody. So even though most of the research we've said has been done on athletes and on actually sports science students, really, a muscle is a muscle is a muscle. I know that dancers sometimes think they've got different muscles, but actually they're all pretty similar. And muscles only do two things: contract and relax. Contract and relax. So that's all that they can do. And we're going to have a look at what we do to change them and how sometimes we have to be careful what we do, that all training is not equal, and it can have quite a major effect. I remember years ago, a person suggested that dancers should take up marathon running because marathon runners are skinny. But dancing isn't like marathon running. So have a quick look at that and the need for specificity in what we're actually trying to do as well. Oh, so point it this way. Aha, so we have got reactive bodies. So that we put a stress on them and then our body can react. Otherwise, unlike, I suppose it's like some people you see their protein powder thinking, oh, if I take my protein powder, I'm going to look like Arnie Schwarzenegger. Unfortunately, there's something else that has to occur in between than just taking your protein powder. And so we need to stress our bodies quite majorly to cause this adaptation for it to say, oh, that was hard. I need to do something now so that hard thing doesn't become so hard. And that is the whole point in what we're really looking at, the strength and conditioning. What we've found as well is quite interestingly in sport and in dance is that often, or mainly in dance at the moment, is we put a load on and then the load stops, and then what happens is then our bodies just carry on. And what we've been doing in sport to try and get this further, faster, better, whatever we're trying to achieve, is that constant trying to stress different aspects of our bodies to try and improve performance. And that's one of the things we need to start looking at within dancers, just to try and help them not become static, but actually starting to adapt and put stresses on it. Against this, we've got our bodies, I always used to say, are like a German design. We're not sure that's so good now with Volkswagen. In that it's an amazing ability to actually be lazy, in that how can I achieve what I'm doing, but easier, with less stress on it. And it's amazing how it can work and say, okay, I'm used to doing that. Can I do this with one muscle? I know I should be using 3. Can I just do it with 1 instead? And it can find out ways of doing it. And so this is one of the interesting things we start to see, especially, actually, we've started to note sometimes with some data on elite dancers, is they're not as much fitter than Joe Public. It's because they're so efficient at what they're doing, it no longer puts a stress on their body, and they've actually got less fit, even though they're doing the same amount, because of their amazing bodies. And that's what our body can do. Oh. So again, if we don't carry on stimulating it, or if the stimulation becomes monotonous, we start to detrain. And this is one interesting thing on this is we've also got this thing called muscle memory, which that first time, if you haven't done any training for a period, you come back and you're thinking, oh, I actually can push the same amount as I did. You can on that time. The next day is so painful, or the following few days, and you've got the John Wayne walk. For the younger generation, that was a cowboy who was in films, because suddenly you won't see the John Wayne films. So, how does we do? We've got 2 areas of adaptation. We often split this into central and peripheral. And this is quite interesting because when we train, we've got to think how we're training this central bit, as well as, and I'll include the head in the central bit, as well as what's happening at a local muscular level as well. So, a lot of this depends on where the person is, how fit they are, how much training exposure they've done. Generally, we see more central adaptation initially before we see peripheral adaptation, but it's not always along those lines, but that's just a general rule of thumb. Central stuff, this can be changes in how we activate muscles, the patterns that we're starting to use, and this is what we often start to see initially in strength training, that we see this increase in strength without actually any increase in muscle size, and that's because we learn to coordinate our movements better. And that's the initial adaptation. So that's usually done, they usually say for 6 to 8 weeks, we start to see this neuromuscular adaptation, a central control theory. Development of our cardiovascular system, i.e. our heart and lungs. Our hearts start to get bigger. We get better at transferring oxygen from our lungs into our bloodstream and pulling out carbon dioxide. And we get better at breathing, higher breathing frequencies and things like that. Our central adaptation we do as we get used to doing cardiovascular work. And also we get better at listening to our bodies, which is quite an interesting thing. And this whole thing about understanding what the stresses we're putting on it, this thing that dancers are quite good at, until obviously come to the DOMS thing and they're thinking, oh, golly, DOMS. And DOMS is good, and it's fine. So it gives us a good indication of what we've done to our body. Was that training session we exposed our body to 2 days ago actually enough to cause an adaptation? Or actually, was it too low and therefore I haven't stressed it enough? We used to have the poke test, very technical thing. Finger, you poke a muscle you trained. Is it painful? That was a good training session. And it's a different ethos as well. And we'll have a look a bit later on how sometimes, as Greg said, it's sometimes hard to incorporate this into training. In sport we can because I'm going to say we're less skillful in some of the sports. And so therefore the movement patterns we're doing, we can do with actually being in a broken down, painful state still. But sometimes it's just thinking how we achieve these things. And there's one guy, a guy called Tim Noakes. Is it just Noakes? Yes, I suddenly had a real blank then. He's an awesome physiologist. He came up with this thing called essential governor theory. Some people like it, some people think it's hogwash. It's a theory, which is the most important thing. It hasn't really been shown. It's this understanding that we can listen and understand how much energy we've got in our cells. He claims you can do that. So just like when you go out for a run, those of you who run, usually within about a minute or so, we know how far and how fast we can go, because he's claiming that feedback is from the rest of our bodies, saying this is how much energy I've got available to me at the moment. But part of that is the whole biofeedback, understanding and listening to understanding what our body, our peripheral says, and adapting what we're doing according to that. The peripheral changes are where exercise physiologists get really excited, or we get excited about the central ones as well, but this is what happens in the muscle. This is one of the things it's hard to see. So as soon as I start working a muscle, I'm putting a stress on it in a certain way. And so if we look at, say, cardiovascular training, how I train will determine how I'm using this thing called my energy units, ATP, will then determine how I replenish that, and then certain enzymes will start to increase. I say if I'm doing lots of endurance training, I increase the enzymes that are used for doing endurance, producing energy in a certain method. If I do sprint training, it does the same, but it's a different set of enzymes. And so this is why we've got to be quite careful of how we train. So for instance, if we look at that person who thought all dancers should become marathon runners, that means, so if we look at Paula Radcliffe, who, actually most marathon runners, Mo Farah, they're all pretty much freaks of nature. They are unbelievable. They're running marathons at between 18 to 20 kilometers an hour. I'd like any of you to go onto a treadmill and last for a minute at that sort of pace. And they do that for 26 miles. But if you ask them to, which is equivalent to about 14 seconds per 100 meters. That's fast. If you ask Paula Radcliffe or Mo, actually Mo is a bad example because he's very fast as well, to actually sprint, most of them can't get much lower than that because they're really, really efficient at producing energy to cope with long-term energy supply. We look at a sprinter, they're awesome at short, sharp stuff, but ask them to go 400 meters. Ask any sprinter to run 400 meters, and he thinks that's a marathon. And so we've got the other end of the extreme, because the way we've trained them means that their way they can produce energy, and when fatigue arises, is very, very specific. So this is when we've got to be careful that all training is not equal. And what we do has an effect at a peripheral level. Also causes this development of supply mechanisms. It's wonderful having it, but unless we get the energy and the oxygen to the muscles, then it's no use. So again, we see increase in capillary supplies, ability as well. The cells increase their ability to pull stuff out of the blood to the muscles that they need it to as well. So all this sort of adaptation is occurring as soon as we start training, whatever training we do. But so if we want to stress it more, we've got to really make sure we're putting the correct stress on the bodies to get the results that we want them to. And also other things we get excited about is structural adaptations of the fibers and the tendons. We put a stress on it, they get stronger. As we get older, unfortunately, our ability to do these adaptations reduces slightly. Our ability to recover gets seriously reduced. If you're above 30, it's not looking good. If you're above 19 in some areas, you're already on the downhill area. So we actually peak quite early. Strength is usually around the 30, 35 area. We peak strength-wise. After that, it's downhill, which is very depressing. But we can still cause changes. And that's one of the things. And this is one of the games. If we look at anthropology, archaeologists, they're the ones who say, aha, this person was a farmer, because it can work out from the movement patterns based on what from the skeleton, what sort of movement patterns they did. So this is the changes that we're going to be putting on our bodies. So what do we get? We do some exercise. Whatever exercise we do, we cause a bit of the muscles to break down initially. So there's a catabolic effect immediately after exercise. And then the body says, oh, that's either hard or easy. And then we have to rebuild it. And so this is the interesting thing we need to do. So the biggest exciting thing, if I get this right, yes, is this thing here. As long as we put enough stress on our body to cause this potential increased stimuli, we now then need to let a recovery occur for that actual improvement to take place. If we don't allow enough recovery, then we don't have time for that adaptation to occur. And different things, I can do it on this way, I forgot, have different times to recover. You can see here, depending on the exercise we do or the stress we're putting on our body, this is hours, so this is the time we've trained, and these are the time it can take for full recovery to occur. This research was initially done on rats by some guys in Russia. And I'll tell you this, I think it's an awesome experiment. It shows how intelligent a rat is, not so hot if you like rats. So we had a sprint group and we had an endurance group of rats. And the rats in the sprint group were on little treadmills and they were doing interval training. And the endurance ones were in a bath of water and they were going backwards and forwards, doing laps. One rat said, oh, this is hard, and sank. And being a good scientist, the guy says, I can't lose one of my subjects, grabbed him out to give him a recovery. At which point they all sank, thinking, I can get a rest here. See, rats are cunning. Unfortunately, they all lost some legs. So you can see, to look at the recovery of what's actually occurring. And we use something called tRNA and dRNA, and these are the things in our muscles which then look at how quickly our body's actually replenished itself and repaired itself. And that's where we've done the research. We've done it on humans. It's not very nice. We have to take muscle biopsies, and people complain about that. But it's not too bad. So if I put a lot of sessions in, we also can have a look at this problem. If I do lots of sessions and not have enough recovery, I start to, if I get it right, have what we call negative supercompensation. I don't actually ever manage to improve. I'm breaking myself down all the time. So what we don't want to do is have these positive versions. Here we've got one that looks as though it's heading downhill, but actually because we have enough rest, we can actually overcome it and it becomes a positive effect. So every session we do, and this is looking at workload and why it's so important, workload is so important to monitor so we don't end up overtraining. Overtraining is a pain. And it's also known as unexplained underperformance syndrome because it's so multifactorial. There's not one often thing that is a really good indicator of what's going on. So what we want to do is maintain people here in this ideal area where they've managed, as they're going up, they're improving. And if we get it right and the right balance, we can see this increase adaptation. But if I don't get enough rest, if I don't get enough fuel inside me of the right sort, if I don't get enough recovery, I start heading down this way. And generally, we start overreaching is excellent, overtraining is awful, overuse is this is the really broken down person, and we actually then take rest as the main way of actually getting them back. And if they're resting, then all these improvements we see are lost again. And so this is the big thing for coaches, to make sure we can keep them on the positive improvements without going over. And this is one of the interesting things I'll talk about a bit later in dance, is if you're already doing so much, how can we increase what we're doing without making dancers go into this sort of area here? So, components of physical fitness or dance performance are all these sort of things here. Every person has an ability in all of them, some awesome, some awful. And it depends on and each sport has a different requirement, or exercise, or dance genre even. We'll talk about this thing about when we say dance, it's a bit dodgy, because it's like saying sport. Sports are too much variation. Same with dance. One of the problems, we're still young in the research. Most of the research is solely on, we've got mainly ballet and contemporary. We've done a bit of dance sport now, and we're doing some break dancing as well. But it still doesn't cover the whole genres we see in dance. So we've just got to, when we see results, just make sure they're genre specific, because otherwise you could be training for a marathon when you should be a sprinter, just the same sort of concept. So everyone has this, and so dance, we know we need lots of flexibility. How much endurance do I need? Coordination has to be good, balance has to be it's very good. And so all these things are different bits. So we've got to look at what do we need for each dance. And this is the interesting thing we've got to play with. So, we've done the dance, the generic thing. We need to do stuff like needs analysis. What are the demands being placed on the dancer by the dance form that they are doing at the moment? And that's the starting point. When we get an understanding of that, then we can then look at to see if the dancer has the fitness requirements to meet the demands being placed on them. And also then we've got an idea then, so how do I then train those components to help improve them? And so this is the sort of thing, so we need to know what's the thing we're trying to achieve first, and then we can work back to see where once we know where we're meant to be going. And this is the fun thing. Ballet is nice, they often repeat performances. Contemporary is a nightmare. Everyone keeps on changing the goalposts. And we've got the same sort of things with another, there's a football, it's interesting, in soccer, there's actually quite a lot of similarity between matches, even though the score might vary quite drastically. And so we've got an idea. We've got very, very little data on what dance performance is. We've got some in ballet and some in contemporary, thanks to Emily, wherever Emily's gone. That was her wonderful thing, watching lots of videos and looking at work-rest ratios, number of jumps, number of lifts. It's highly exciting stuff, and but it's something which needs to be done, so we've got a much better idea. We can't use the GPS systems they use in sport, because they're inside. They don't work unless you're doing open-air dance sort of things. Where is the dancer as well? We're getting a bit more data on how fit dancers are. The first study was done in 1984, and we still don't know enough. That's quite a simple thing. We've got a vague idea. The only nice thing we have in dance, which is unlike in sport, is we've got a lot of stuff on elite. In sport, when we look at some of the fitness data, it's often done on subjects of convenience, i.e. my students. And this is the first time in dance, actually, we've got much more elite data than we actually do often find in sport. That is actually available for others to see, should I say, because often they do have stuff on elite, but there's no way that any institute is going to publish it, because that means their competitors are in another country, know their data on their person. We're not that bad in dance, which is quite good. One of the things we've got on here is, I always refer to dancers as boy racer cars, awesome fancy exterior with very small engines. And this is the whole thing that we're looking at, is how can we move from a 900 cc up to at least about, I think only about a 1.1 or 1.2. We're not looking at making an enormous increase in their strength and conditioning because they're a high skill sport. We're not producing a marathon runner or a sprinter. They're pretty gross, not much coordination. Well, there's a bit of coordination so they don't fall over. But there's not much skill involved compared with dance. We're still dealing with high skill things, so the strength and conditioning is important, but it's in support of, and it's not a fundamental to the actual performance itself. How does the dancer meet the demands? How do we fit stuff into their training schedule? We don't have pre-seasons, like in sport. I've got 5 minutes as well. This is okay. We're not too far off. And so we've got to try and work out how, I think Greg said this quite nicely, is where do we actually fit this stuff in? And the other thing we've discovered, often dancers, when they go on holiday, like to have a holiday. Often in elite sport, if you come back off holiday and you've dropped down too much, you get fined. Imagine that in a dance company. You're not fit enough, you get fined. I don't think that'll work quite yet, but that's what they have in sport. So we've got to look at where we are. So at the moment, we need more data. For me as a scientist, I always like data. Without data, I'm dead. To see what we need to understand about variations. One thing we found, say, Nick and I did for a long time, is dancers never seem to get fit. All their fitness test data for a long time was the same. That's because they had 5 weeks off and they'd actually detrained in that time. So they probably were getting much fitter during the season, but when the time we were testing them, they weren't actually always back to the beginning again. And so that's something else to look at. So more and more places are doing throughout the year testing, so we get an idea of what does the optimal dancers need to be, and then we can work on it. I'd like to see that for dancers to be working about 80% of their maximal capacities at everything, rather than at 100%, which we're seeming to find at the moment. And this is some of the things we just quickly talked about earlier. It's this whole thing, if I'm doing 36 hours plus of dancing, where am I going to fit in the supplemental training? If I'm a student already doing 20 hours, they say do about 20 hours here, and then they've got academic stuff, and then they have to then do some stuff. How do I fit it in? And this is if we do try and add it, am I just going to tip them over the edge? Because they're pretty close to the edge at the moment, because they're working pretty close to full capacity, to actually then causing them to be overtrained and start getting injuries. So there might be a period when we end up having that until we've increased their capacity, so then everything else is less of a demand on their bodies. I'm not saying that we have to break them all down. We've got to look at periods when we actually can train them. And this sometimes means they might have to be doing this during their 5-week holiday period, which at the moment they'd say this is a time off. It might be the time when they need to start training hard, when it doesn't matter. So this is the whole thing about quality rather than quantity of training. Because if you remember, again, lots of the stuff in the literature you say, or you've got to do something 3 times a week to get a change. You don't need to do it 3 times a week, because I'm already doing 36 hours of training. I only maybe need a little bit more to see a change. I think, Emily, you did yours, it was 2 hours, wasn't it? It
was 2 hours once a week.
2 hours once a week, big change. Also, those fitter dancers all were perceived to be dance better as well. And we did that in ballet and we did that in contemporary as well. So we have shown that fitter dancers dance better, aesthetically or visually or artistically, with people grading their dancing. And so we don't need much to cause an improvement. Eventually, hopefully, it won't be seen as supplemental training, it'll be integral to their training. And it won't be as something, how do I fit in? It'll be part of their daily schedule or weekly schedule that they might have some training sessions they need to do. The other thing to think about is when I fit it in the day, if you do weights or you do some training, the ability to do fine motor skill movements for the next hour or 2 afterwards is gone. So if you train and then go straight into a class and you have to do fine motor skills, you're going to have the wobbles. And so you're going to lose that. So you've got to look at when you can fit it into your daily schedule, not to have an effect or a negative effect on your dancing. If you're trying to introduce into a new area and a new school and they're a bit skeptical at first of you doing it and then you bring it in, and the first session you come in, they all got the wobbles, and they can't do their dance class, you're not going to have very happy teachers. And so you've got to look at how you incorporate it in. Done. That was good, wasn't it? On time. Thank you.